Chapter 1. Salt and Sorrow. The wind tasted of brine and regret. It wasn't the familiar tang of the azure current, the lifeblood of Kul Tiras, but something far older, something corrupted. It whipped across the skeletal remains of a once proud carrack now half buried in the ochre silt, carrying with it a constant, unsettling hiss, the sound of the sea retreating, a slow, deliberate swallowing of the world. Captain Lyra Stormblade adjusted the worn leather of her gauntlet, her gaze fixed on the ravaged coastline. The sun, a bruised orange smear through the haze, cast long, distorted shadows from the shattered masts and splintered planks of the grave of ships. It wasn't a battlefield in the traditional sense, not anymore. It was a graveyard, a testament to the savagery of the Salt War, and the growing, horrifying truth of why it had begun. 3 days. 3 days since the last confirmed truce, brokered by a handful of exhausted, shell-shocked representatives who'd barely managed to extract a promise of shared water rations before the next volley of arrows erupted. 3 days of unrelenting slaughter, of Stormwind men driven to a brutal, almost animalistic fury, Darkspear Trolls utilizing their innate shamanistic abilities with a chilling precision, and the Sentinels of Darnassus, haunted by a grief so profound it seemed to warp their very magic, hacking at the advancing tide. Lyra, a veteran of countless skirmishes, a woman carved from the granite of Stormwind's coastal defenses, felt a particular visceral disgust for this conflict. It wasn't about honor, or land, or even the meager resources being fought over the dwindling springs choked with salt and despair. It was about a mindless, self-destructive obsession with dominance, fueled by a fear as ancient and potent as the void itself. "Anything, Sergeant Varro?" she called out, her voice raspy from the wind and the constant grit of the salt-laden dust. Sergeant Varro, a mountain of a man built like a walking siege engine, grunted in response, scanning the perimeter with a battered spyglass. "Still no sign of movement from the troll raiding party, Captain. Just more bodies. And the seas creeping further in with each passing hour. It's unsettling. It feels personal." Personal was an understatement. The retreat of the ocean wasn't simply a natural phenomenon. It was an active, deliberate force. The salt wasn't just accumulating, it was actively clinging to the exposed land, leaching the color from everything it touched. And, beneath the surface of the receding water, the air thrummed with a discordant energy, a vibration that resonated deep within Lyra's bones, the signature of N'Zoth, the drowned one. Shed dismissed the whispers initially, attributed them to the fatigue and the sheer horror of the situation. But the increasing frequency of the localized seismic disturbances, the sudden unnatural surges of the remaining fresh water, the rising tide of spectral forms glimpsed just beyond the haze, they couldn't be ignored. The lore keepers of Stormwind, those who dared to delve into the shadowed histories of Azeroth, spoke of N'Zoth, a being of immense corrupting power, exiled centuries ago for attempting to plunge the world into an eternal oceanic night. Now it seemed he was attempting to finish what he started, the discovery of the anchor of eternal night, unearthed amidst the wreckage of the confirmed her worst fears. A pulsating shard of solidified void, radiating an unnatural cold. It was the key, the mechanism by which N'Zoth was deliberately stripping the ocean from the world. Lyra shifted her weight, her hand instinctively resting on the hilt of her cutlass. The cannon crew, a handful of Stormwind veterans and a few desperate volunteers from the Darkspear, were diligently manning the salvaged artillery pieces, repurposed ship cannons, jury-rigged to hurl iron balls into the swirling chaos. "Hold the line, men," she barked, her voice carrying over the din of the approaching war. "Don't let them get past the high ground. We're buying time." Time for what? She didn't know. Time for the elves to complete their intricate ritual. Time for the trolls to gather their strength. Time for anything other than the inevitable. Just then, a shriek pierced the air. the unmistakable cry of a sentinel. Varro roared, leading a charge against a swarm of grotesque, waterlogged figures. They weren't merely drowned sailors, they were animated corpses, their bodies infused with the drowned one's power, driven by a mindless hunger for destruction. The Drowned Legion. As Lyra watched, a shard of agonizing realization pierced through her grim determination. The Salt War wasn't a byproduct of the drought. It was a deliberate distraction, a carefully orchestrated element of a much larger, far more terrifying design. Azeroth wasn't just trying to destroy Kul Tiras. He was preparing the ground for a resurrection of unimaginable proportions. And, as the ground beneath their feet shuddered, revealing a gaping chasm filled with swirling iridescent void, Lyra knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that they were not merely fighting for survival, they were fighting to prevent the world from being swallowed by the eternal abyss. Chapter 2. Echoes of the Deep. The roar of the returning tide was a physical assault, a visceral rejection of the agonizing silence that had gripped the grave of ships for days. The air itself felt thick, saturated with the metallic tang of brine and something older, something infinitely colder, the scent of the void. Lyra, covered in grime and the slick residue of animated water, stood on the precipice of a shattered world, watching the emerald waves reclaim their dominion. The last vestiges of the Drowned Legion, a tangle of bloated limbs and vacant eyes, were being swept out to sea, dissolving into the chaotic churn. It was a brutal, beautiful spectacle, a testament to a desperate victory. "Report," she commanded, her voice raspy, laced with exhaustion that ran deeper than mere physical fatigue. The assembled ranks of Stormwind artillerymen, a ragged collection of hardened veterans and young recruits, shifted nervously, their faces pale beneath the bruised gray sky. Spear, her name now synonymous with unwavering resolve, was barking orders herself, directing the dismantling of the makeshift gun emplacements. Cannonballs are down to 20 rounds per gun. We'll need to salvage more from the wreckage, but the priority is consolidating our position. Her movements were precise, efficient, born of years spent on the volatile front line. The trolls are reporting a localized increase in the intensity of the lightning. The shamanic work is proving effective, though draining. From the tangled cluster of Darkspear warriors, punctuated by the rhythmic chanting of their shamans, came a terse acknowledgement. The sea burns, Sentinel. The Legion yields, but the corruption remains. We are bolstering our wards, attempting to contain the spread. Torvin Stonehand, a veteran of countless skirmishes and a formidable warrior in his own right, stepped forward, his scarred face grim. The water, it's not just death, Lyra. It's a yearning, a hunger. We are fighting against something fundamentally wrong, something ancient and terribly patient. The Elves, a spectral presence amidst the chaos, were less outwardly vocal. The senior Sentinels, led by the venerable Master Arian, remained largely silent, their movements deliberate, almost ritualistic. They were meticulously analyzing the shards of the prism ruin, remnants of the complex arcane arrangement that had focused Elune's light upon the anchor. "The prism is destabilized," Arian finally stated, his voice a low, resonant hum. The void's influence corrupted its structure at a fundamental level. Reconstructing a sufficient conduit will require considerable effort, and the echoes of Azeroth's influence are growing stronger. Lyra understood. They weren't merely repairing a shattered artifact, they were battling an encroaching tide of corruption. A subtle but persistent erosion of reality itself. She turned her gaze back to the churning water, a profound unease settling over her. The immediate threat, the Drowned Legion, had been contained, but the underlying malignancy remained, a silent, suffocating presence. The revelation about the Salt War, the deliberate orchestration of conflict, had shifted the nature of their struggle. It wasn't simply about seizing dwindling resources. It was a pawn in a cosmic game played by a being whose understanding of time and consequence was utterly alien. The sudden unveiling of the anchor, triggered by the unstable ground, had been a cruel, almost theatrical, flourish by N'Zoth. A test. As the last of the drowned legion vanished beneath the waves, a new sound emerged, a low, rhythmic thrumming that seemed to resonate, not just in the air, but within their bones. The ground began to vibrate again, this time with a more controlled, deliberate force. A section of the seabed, previously concealed beneath a deceptively stable layer of silt, fractured open, revealing a wider expanse of the iridescent void. "By the light," Torvin breathed, his hand instinctively reaching for his axe. "The abyss it's reaching." From the depths of the newly exposed void, shapes began to coalesce, not the grotesque, animated corpses of the Legion, but something infinitely stranger. They were amorphous, shifting masses of black energy, vaguely humanoid in form, their surfaces rippling with internal currents of darkness. They didn't attack with aggression, their presence radiating an unnerving sense of ancient, unfathomable intelligence. "They're studying us," Arian murmured, his face etched with a rare and chilling realization. "N'Zoth isn't merely corrupting the world, Hes learning from it. Hes mimicking our attempts at defense, anticipating our every move. Hes becoming adaptive." Lyra felt a surge of icy dread. This wasn't a battle against a single enemy. It was a confrontation with a force that existed beyond the constraints of their understanding. A force that was actively evolving, adapting, learning. "Spear," her face grim, barked the order. "Prepare the artillery. We have to hold them back. This isn't a war, it's a stalling tactic. We're giving the Elves time, giving the Trolls their chance. But if this grows, if it learns to exploit our weaknesses, we're all lost." As the cannon fire resumed, a ragged, desperate barrage against the nascent horrors emerging from the void, Lyra knew one thing with absolute certainty: the tide had turned, not just against the drowned Legion, but against everything they had fought to protect. The fate of Azeroth hung not on a shattered artifact, but on a desperate, fragile alliance forged in the heart of a drowned world, a defiance against a god who reveled in oblivion. Chapter 3: Echoes of the Deep. The rain began subtly, a fine gray mist that clung to the newly risen cliffs, carrying the acrid scent of ozone and something older, something like decaying coral and forgotten grief. It wasn't a comforting rain, not the life-giving balm of a true storm, but a sorrowful drizzle, an echo of the vastness that had been swallowed. The three leaders, Arian, Lyra, and Spear, stood huddled atop the highest salvaged wreck, a shattered galleon, the storm's fury, now a skeletal monument to the conflict watching the ocean reclaim its dominion. The immediate aftermath was a chaotic dance of salvage and recovery. Stormwind's engineers, surprisingly adept at adapting their siege weaponry, were already deploying mobile repair teams to stabilize the crumbling coastline. The Darkspear shamans, still subtly vibrating with residual void energy, were meticulously cleansing pools of tainted water with blessed obsidian and intricate rune circles, a desperate attempt to heal the land's wounds. The Elves, led by the stoic Master Aeliana, were systematically cataloging the prismatic fragments of the shattered prism, attempting to understand the mechanics of their own devastating attack, and, more importantly, to prevent a similar vulnerability. Yet, a palpable tension hung in the air, thicker than the mist. The initial relief, the knowledge that the immediate threat of annihilation had passed, was quickly overshadowed by a deeper unease. The silence of the drowned Legion was gone, replaced by a disconcerting stillness. The skeletal forms, once a raging tide of corrupted flesh, lay dormant, drained of their animated malice. But they hadn't simply dispersed. They were waiting. "The sensors aren't picking up any residual void signature," Aeliana reported, her voice tight with concentration, her fingers tracing the intricate lines of a newly constructed arcane monitor. "It said the energy was absorbed, completely neutralized. But the residue, the echo of N'Zoth's observation, remains." Spear grunted, adjusting the grip on his hand-forged warhammer. So, he's not just gone. He's learning. Damn him and his cosmic chess game. Lyra, observing the silent, watchful forms of the drowned legion, felt a renewed wave of dread. "It's more than learning," she said, her voice low. "It's like he's studying our reactions, anticipating our fear. He doesn't just want to destroy, he wants to destruction." Arian, typically the most measured of the trio, stepped forward, his face illuminated by the ethereal glow of a miniature prism head retrieved from the anchor's remains. The initial analysis suggests the disruption of the anchor wasn't merely a collapse of the artifact, but a severing of a connection. A node, if you will, through which Azeroth was receiving and processing information. He paused, his gaze distant, as not operating from a single location anymore, as distributed, fragmented across the drowned landscape. The realization was terrifyingly simple. Noth hadn't simply been manipulating events, had been conducting an experiment, a horrifying study of civilization's inherent weaknesses. The Salt War hadn't been a diversion, it had been a carefully crafted provocation, designed to accelerate that study. "We need to understand how he's communicating," Spear stated, his voice carrying the weight of grim responsibility. "Find out where these fragments are, and eliminate them. Before he can fully comprehend us." Their efforts shifted from reactive defense to proactive investigation. Eliana and her elven scholars, aided by the trolls, shamanic abilities now focused on detecting subtle shifts in the ambient magical energy, began a systematic sweep of the exposed seabed, utilizing specialized void resonance crystals to identify pockets of lingering corruption. Stormwind's engineers, adapting their artillery, now employed a different tactic, deploying sonic disruptors designed to shatter the crystalline structures forming the fragments of Noth's presence. But they were fighting a ghost. The fragments shifted, reformed, disappeared before their sensors could lock onto them. It was as if Noth was actively concealing his influence, a predator subtly altering its hunting ground. As days bled into weeks, a disturbing pattern emerged. The fragments weren't clustered in areas of high conflict. Instead, they seemed to gravitate towards places of significant emotional resonance, ancient temples, forgotten battlefields, even the ruins of homes swallowed by the receding tide. Azeroth wasn't merely interested in knowledge, he was interested in. Lyra, during one particularly unsettling investigation, discovered a fragment embedded within the ruins of a Stormwind orphanage, meticulously replicated in miniature, a horrifying echo of lost children. When she attempted to dismantle the fragment, a wave of paralyzing despair washed over her, a visceral understanding of the agonizing horror Naz sought to experience. "Hes not just studying our defenses," she whispered, clutching her head. "Hes feeding on our grief, our regret, our fear. Hes building himself with the wreckage of our souls." The rain continued, a constant reminder of their precarious situation. The alliance, forged in desperate necessity, was fraying at the edges. Mistrust, born from years of ingrained hostility, began to resurface. The shared victory felt less like a triumph, and more like a temporary reprieve before a far more insidious war. Spear, ever pragmatic, offered a chilling assessment. "We've traded one monstrous god for an army of ghosts. And I suspect," he added, his eyes scanning the silent, watchful forms of the drowned legion, "that this is only the beginning." Chapter 4. The Echo of Sorrow. The rain hadn't stopped. It wasn't a cleansing rain, not anymore. It was a sorrowful drizzle, a constant, insistent weeping that mirrored the dampness clinging to everything, the ravaged stone, Lyra's threadbare cloak, and increasingly, the faces of the Alliance. The initial euphoria of survival had curdled into a heavy, suffocating dread. The shattered anchor had receded the void, yes, but it hadn't washed away the unsettling truth revealed by the fragments, and more disturbingly, by Azeroth himself. The grave of ships, once a chaotic battleground, was now a silent, glistening graveyard, perpetually slick with seawater. The trio Lyra, Spear, and the stoic high priestess Alara stood surveying the scene, the faint glow of Elune's light struggling to penetrate the persistent mist. The alliance was a precarious thing, held together by a shared terror and a rapidly diminishing supply of hope. "It's not the sea that threatens us," Lyra said, her voice strained. "It's the memory. Azeroth isn't simply harvesting knowledge, as constructing a resonant chamber, amplifying our darkest moments, as consuming them." Spear grunted, his hand instinctively resting on the haft of his axe. "The drowned legion, they aren't mindless. They move with a calculated lethargy, as if responding to something beyond the command of a single being. We've purged entire warbands of undead, Lyra. This is different." He gestured towards a group of the waterlogged figures patrolling the periphery of the wreckage, their movements slow and deliberate, as if absorbing the ambient despair. Alara, who had remained largely silent, her face etched with a profound sadness, finally spoke, her voice a low, resonant murmur. "Azeroth, he understands the nature of suffering. He recognizes that the most potent weapons aren't forged in steel, but in the heart. He doesn't need to destroy us, he needs to with us." Their recent exploration of the Stormwind orphanage fragment had solidified this terrifying realization. The miniature replica, meticulously constructed of bone and salt, hadn't just been a data point, it had been an experience, a brutal injection of a child's last, desperate terror. Lyra hadn't merely witnessed the horror shed it. A chilling echo of the lost children imprinted upon her very soul. The experience had left her profoundly shaken, haunted by phantom cries and the suffocating weight of unimaginable grief. "We need to understand how he's doing this," Lyra said, clutching at her head, a subtle tremor running through her. "The fragments, they're not just echoes. They're anchors. He's deliberately seeking out places saturated with emotion, feeding off the residual energy." Their investigation led them to the ruins of an old Darkspear war camp, meticulously rebuilt in miniature, mirroring a brutal defeat decades prior. The air around the miniature encampment was thick with a palpable tension, a lingering resentment palpable even in its scaled-down form. As Lyra attempted to examine the fragment embedded within a shattered drum, she felt a surge of cold, burning rage, the fury of a lost warrior, the bitterness of defeat, amplified 1,000-fold. "It's not merely observing our pain," she gasped, staggering back. Has turning our failures into weapons." Spear, witnessing her distress, moved to intercept, but stopped short, recognizing the profound, almost primal fear gripping Lyra. The Sentinels of Darnassus, the Elves, possess an innate understanding of magical resonance. Perhaps they can offer some insight into this amplification. Alara, after a moment of contemplative silence, revealed a chilling observation. The Elves have long studied the manipulation of emotions through arcane energies. They practiced a form of soul binding, a dangerous ritual, aimed at harnessing the emotional strength of individuals for the benefit of the community. Azeroth, he's perfected this art, weaponizing it against us. As they delved deeper, they discovered that Azeroth wasn't simply collecting fragments, he was meticulously crafting them. He was layering grief, regret, and fear, weaving them into a monstrous tapestry designed to unravel their resistance. The rain intensified, a relentless drumming on the ravaged landscape, and the drowned legion moved closer, their silent vigilance growing more insistent. "We're not fighting an enemy," Lyra whispered, her voice choked with despair. "We're fighting ourselves. Azeroth isn't trying to conquer Azeroth, he's trying to break it, to drown it in sorrow." The realization hung heavy in the air, a terrifying truth that offered no easy solution, no comforting certainty, only the chilling understanding that the greatest threat wasn't a god of darkness, but the darkness within themselves. Chapter 5. The Echo of Sorrow. The rain hadn't stopped, a relentless gray curtain that smeared the already bruised sky. The air hung thick with salt, and the metallic tang of decaying flesh, a grim perfume that clung to Lyra's throat. The ceasefire, fragile as spun glass, was holding, but the uneasy truce felt less like an alliance and more like a postponement of a shared, inevitable doom. The three faction leaders, Stormwind's Captain Valerius, the Darkspear Shaman Spear, and the Sentinel Elder Ilara, stood huddled amongst the crumbling remains of a once grand temple, its marble cracked and slick with seawater. The sight of the shattered anchor of eternal night, now a jagged shard of obsidian pulsing with residual void energy, confirmed their most terrifying suspicion. "He didn't just want to destabilize us," Ilara said, her voice a low, measured cadence. "He wanted to us." The prism, salvaged from the ruined citadel of Pharos, lay beside her, radiating a faint, pulsing light. A desperate attempt to contain the insidious influence seeping from the shard. The Elves, in our pursuit of arcane understanding, were always aware of the inherent resonance of emotion. The ancient texts spoke of soul binding, a practice we abandoned centuries ago, rightly so. But N'Zoth has perfected it. Spear grunted, a low rumble of disapproval. Such a concept unsettling. A god manipulating grief. It goes against the very nature of the void. His hands, weathered and scarred from a lifetime spent channeling the raw power of the elements, tightened around a small, intricately carved totem. But the evidence, the relentless amplification of our fears, our regrets, it is undeniable. Lyra felt a particular chill, not just from the rain, but from the depth of Ilara's observation. The amplification wasn't random. She had begun to notice subtle patterns, echoing whispers in the minds of her companions, feeding on their vulnerabilities. Valerius, a man of unwavering resolve, was plagued by visions of Stormwind's fall. The faces of his fallen comrades contorted in silent accusation. Spear's usually stoic demeanor was laced with a simmering fury, a primal rage directed at a loss he couldn't articulate, a sorrow that felt as ancient as the mountains themselves. "We've been so focused on the physical threat," Lyra said, her voice strained, "that we've failed to recognize the true nature of the enemy. Noth isn't simply seeking to drown Azeroth, he's seeking to drown." The conversation shifted, becoming a somber dissection of their own histories, their failings, their deepest regrets. Valerius confessed to a moment of hesitation during the siege of Darkshore, a single fatal second where he could have altered the course of events. Spear spoke of the loss of his clan, a brutal massacre orchestrated by the Orcish warlords, a wound that never truly healed. Ilara, usually a bastion of calm, revealed a hidden guilt, a suspicion that her own relentless pursuit of arcane knowledge had contributed to the growing vulnerability of the Sentinels. As they laid bare their vulnerabilities, the rain intensified, mirroring the storm within their minds. The drowned legion, sensing the shift in their opponent's resolve, moved with a chilling precision. The waterlogged corpses, animated by N'Zoth's will, weren't simply mindless drones. They were imbued with a fragmented awareness, fueled by the very sorrow they were meant to inspire. They advanced with silent, deliberate steps, their skeletal hands reaching out as if to grasp the souls of the living. "Hes not just amplifying our fear," Lyra realized, her eyes scanning the advancing legion. "Hes on it. The drowned legion isn't just a force of destruction, it's a manifestation of our collective despair. Each corpse, each movement, is a reflection of our deepest anxieties." Valerius, momentarily freed from the visions plaguing him, barked orders, directing the remaining Stormwind artillery to bombard the closest ranks of the drowned legion with targeted volleys. Spear unleashed a torrent of searing lightning, momentarily incinerating a cluster of animated corpses, but the effort seemed to further exhaust him, leaving him visibly weakened. Ilara, however, was enacting a desperate countermeasure. Using the prism, she attempted to refract the void energy emanating from the anchor, hoping to disrupt the emotional resonance. The effort strained her, her face contorted in concentration. The prism, it's destabilizing, she gasped, her voice strained. The anchor isn't just a conduit for Nell's power, it's a focal point for all the sorrow, the regret, the loss, accumulated across millennia. As she spoke, a new sound joined the relentless rain, a low, mournful hum, rising from the anchor itself, a siren song of despair echoing across the ravaged landscape. Lyra understood then. N'Zoth hadn't just sought to break Azeroth. He sought to drown the world in the echoes of its own tragic past. And in that realization, she understood that the greatest battle wasn't against a god, but against the darkness they carried within themselves. Chapter 6. Echoes of the deep. The rain had shifted, becoming a persistent, clinging mist, thick with the scent of brine and something far older, something akin to crushed bone and forgotten grief. The immediate carnage of the grave of ships was fading under the returning tide, but the psychological wounds of the last 72 hours remained, raw and pulsing beneath the surface of the newly formed alliance. The silence after the anchor's shattering was not peaceful, but heavy, laden with the weight of what had been unleashed, and more disturbingly, what had been glimpsed. Valerius, leaning heavily against a crumbling mast, felt the familiar tremor in his vision. A deeper resonance this time. The exertion, the sheer terror of witnessing N'Zoth's influence solidified in the drowned legion, had stripped away some of the initial strategic focus. He gripped his command staff, the wood worn smooth by countless battles, and stared out at the expanse of the returning ocean, a vast, hungry maw consuming the remnants of a drowned world. "The artillery's efficiency is dropping," he rasped, his voice hoarse. "The constant bombardment, the strain on the crews. It's taking a toll. We need to rotate, pull back before we burn ourselves out." Spear, slumped against a half-submerged bastion, remained a flickering ember of his former self. The lightning, channeled through his shamanic connection, had been brutal, a desperate measure against a tide of animated corpses that seemed to absorb and regenerate with horrifying speed. The exhaustion was not just physical, it was a bone-deep weariness, a feeling that had touched something profoundly wrong, something that had resonated with the darkest corners of his own soul. He didn't speak, only periodically massaging the burning where the lightning had struck his arm, a futile attempt to quell the lingering sensation of phantom agony. Ilara, however, was a study in controlled desperation. The prism, meticulously crafted from shards of the fallen ruin, hummed faintly against her outstretched hand, a fragile shield against the encroaching void. She hadn't slept in 3 days, fueled solely by bitter black tea and the unwavering conviction that she was on the precipice of something vital. The strain was etched into every line of her face, her silver eyes burning with an unnerving intensity. "The prism, it's still destabilizing," she repeated, her voice a thin, brittle thread. "It's not just a conduit, it's a receiver, a collector. N'Zoth isn't simply manipulating the sorrow. The sorrow solidified. The low, mournful hum intensified. No longer just a sonic anomaly, but a palpable force. It didn't rise from the anchor itself, but a wave of pure, unadulterated grief washing over the battlefield. Valerius felt it then, not a vision, but a memory, fragmented and visceral. He saw the burning of Darnassus, the fall of Stormwind, the endless brutal cycles of war that had defined Azeroth for millennia. He tasted the salt of countless tears, felt the cold grip of despair. It wasn't sorrow, but it was undeniably, terrifyingly present. Lyra, observing Ilara with a profound understanding, approached cautiously. "Has not trying to break us," she said, her voice quiet, almost reverent. "Has trying to remind us of what we've forgotten, of the terrible cost of ambition, of the futility of vengeance, of the inherent tragedy of existence. N'Zoth doesn't seek destruction, he seeks remembrance, a perfect, eternal monument to despair." A shudder passed through her. She had been fighting a god, but she had been fighting a reflection, a carefully crafted illusion designed to exploit their vulnerabilities. The salt war, the desperate scramble for water, the mindless slaughter, it was all part of the performance, a stage meticulously set to amplify their suffering. The anchor isn't just a focus for Nenzoth's power, Ilara continued, her voice regaining a flicker of its earlier strength. It's a repository, a place where the echoes of every death, every heartbreak, every lost hope have gathered over eons. It's a wound in the fabric of reality, a point where the past bleeds into the present. She turned to Valerius and Spear. We can't simply destroy the anchor. We must it. We need to introduce a counter-resonance, something to absorb the sorrow, to silence the hum. An idea, born of desperation and a horrifyingly clear understanding, solidified in her mind. The prism, it's imperfect. It reflects, but it doesn't truly absorb. We need to augment it with something pure, something that embodies hope. She looked out at the surging tide, a grim determination settling upon her features. The heart of a hero, a sacrifice. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. The alliance, forged in the crucible of near extinction, felt the weight of a new, terrifying question: could even a unified front, fueled by desperation and guided by a fragile understanding, truly stand against the tide of a god's sorrow? Chapter 7. The weight of echoes, the roar of the returning tide, a sound both terrifying and profoundly restorative, had faded to a rhythmic pulse. The air, thick with brine and the lingering scent of burnt flesh, still carried the metallic tang of the anchor's destruction. The exposed seabed, once a graveyard of shattered ships and dried silt, now resembled a bruised, pulsating wound, slowly, agonizingly, healing. Ilara stood atop the highest remaining wreckage, the shattered prism clutched in her hands. It was a grotesque thing now, scarred and fractured, yet radiating a faint, almost sickly luminescence, a pale imitation of Ilune's grace. Across from her, Valerius, his face etched with exhaustion and a burgeoning understanding of the enormity of what they'd faced, meticulously examined a section of the exposed bedrock, searching for any trace of residual void energy. Spear, ever the stoic, maintained a watchful perimeter, his hand never far from the rune-etched blade strapped to his thigh. The silence was broken only by the lapping of the water and the quiet, unsettling murmur of the recovered corpses, now resting peacefully beneath the waves, no longer animated by Nazov's influence. Yet, the air remained thick with the palpable residue of anguish, the accumulated sorrow of countless deaths, a sentiment Ilara's words had unveiled. It's stronger here, Valerius stated, his voice low and grave. He pointed to a patch of shimmering, iridescent sediment. The anchor didn't just hold the void, it amplified the emotions that fed it. This is a saturation point. The sheer volume of suffering it collected. We knew this, didn't we? Spear's voice was a gravelly counterpoint, devoid of judgment, simply observing. The price of wielding power is always a reflection of the darkness we combat. Ilara didn't respond immediately. She stared out at the burgeoning waves, her brow furrowed in a rare moment of contemplative stillness. It's not just suffering, is it? It's for suffering. The fear, the regret, the unanswered prayers. Noth didn't just collect pain, he cultivated it, nurturing it, allowing it to flourish. Her gaze drifted to the three figures huddled beside her Stormwind representatives, Darkspear warriors, and the remaining members of Darnassus' Sentinel Order. Their faces, etched with the horrors they'd witnessed, spoke volumes of shared trauma, a collective burden that bound them together. The prism can't absorb it, she said, her voice gaining a quiet intensity. It's a passive reflector. To transmute the anchor, we need an active agent, something to actively counter the resonance, to absorb the echoes. We need intention. The suggestion hung heavy in the air. Valerius was the first to break the silence. You're suggesting a sacrifice, a deliberate infusion of hope, perhaps, to counteract the despair. Precisely, Elara confirmed, her eyes fixed on the turbulent water. But it won't be simply offering a life. It will be offering a willingness to shoulder the weight of that sorrow, to become a beacon against the tide. The realization settled upon them, a chilling inevitability. The concept of a single heroic sacrifice, once a convenient narrative of desperation, now felt profoundly complex. The anchor wasn't just a target, it was a vessel for the accumulated grief of a world. To confront it, they needed to offer something equally profound, a willingness to become part of that burden. "We've discussed the obvious," Spear said, his voice carrying a weary resonance. A champion, a warrior, would be swiftly consumed. The anchor would feast on their courage, their resolve, their very souls. "Then we look beyond the battlefield," Elara responded, her voice almost a whisper. "We look to those who have felt the deepest resonance of the anchor's sorrow, those who have suffered the most profound loss." A collective glance spread amongst the Alliance. The implications were terrifyingly clear. The solution, offered with chilling pragmatism, wasn't about a single death, but about a sustained commitment to a heartbreaking fate. The act would not be a dramatic, defiant gesture, but a quiet, almost invisible absorption, a constant, selfless bearing of the world's pain. The weight of the question settled upon them, heavy and suffocating. Could they truly ask someone to willingly embrace the anchor's sorrow? Could they fully comprehend the depth of that sacrifice? The horrifying beauty of such a deliberate surrender? Elara closed her eyes, battling with the unsettling realization. "We're not offering martyrdom," she said, her voice firm, resolute. "We're offering a choice to acknowledge the darkness, to accept the burden, to become a grounding point for the echoes. To refuse is to allow Nezoth to continue to feed, to allow Azeroth to drown in its own sorrows." The tide continued to rise, a relentless, indifferent force. And as Elara opened her eyes, she saw not just the returning ocean, but a reflection of the desperate, terrifying choice. They faced a choice that demanded not just courage, but an almost unbearable willingness to carry the weight of the world's lost hope. Chapter 8. The echoes within the salt spray stung Elara's eyes, a constant, insistent reminder of the devastation and the impending choice. The ocean, now a roaring turquoise behemoth, clawed back across the seabed, swallowing the skeletal remains of ships and the lingering dust of the graveyard. The air hung thick with the scent of brine, ozone, and something older, something akin to despair, a flavor that clung to the back of the throat. The Alliance, a hesitant knot of exhaustion and grim determination, stood atop the highest remaining wreckage of a shattered galleon, the wind whipping Elara's silver hair around her face. Stormwind's Captain Meridian, a veteran of countless battles, stood rigidly, his hand instinctively resting on the pommel of his broadsword. Across from him, Grognak the Destroyer, the Darkspear Shaman, pulsed with a low, internal energy, his eyes glowing with the unsettling violet light of summoned lightning. And beside them, Lyra Shadowsong, a Sentinel of Darnassus, remained unnervingly still, her arcane energy thrumming beneath her skin like a contained storm. The silence, broken only by the relentless roar of the ocean, was palpable, weighted by the implications Elara had articulated. "To become a grounding point for the echoes," Shed said, a phrase that echoed the unnatural, persistent whispers that had accompanied the anchor's exposure. It wasn't about destruction, not directly. It was about absorption, a deliberate, sacrificial incorporation of the suffering that permeated the very fabric of existence. "It's unsettling, Elara," Meridian finally said, his voice roughened by disuse and apprehension. "You speak of becoming vessels for sorrow. It smacks of blasphemy. It smacks of survival, Lyra countered, her voice measured and precise. Noth didn't merely unleash a drought. He weaponized grief. The anchor doesn't just contain the voided on the emotions it generates. To fight that with steel and fire is a futile exercise. We need to break the cycle. Grognak, ever pragmatic, grunted. The orcs have seen the things that eat the soul. The old gods are masters of shadow. To disrupt their hunger requires a sacrifice. He raised a hand, his eyes fixed on the churning water, as if attempting to parse the tormented energy radiating from the newly submerged seabed. A willing sacrifice. The word hung in the air, a poisoned dart. Willing. Will. It was the crux of the matter. The idea wasn't born of a noble, heroic impulse, it was born of desperation, of the brutal calculus that survival demanded. Elara walked towards the edge of the wreckage, the cold spray washing over her. We've witnessed the annihilation of entire civilizations, the utter erasure of existence. We've stared into the abyss and felt it stare back. This isn't about choosing to feel pain, it's about accepting that pain find us, regardless. The anchor isn't a prison, it's a conduit. If we refuse to acknowledge the currents will drown us all. She turned, her gaze sweeping across the faces of her companions. We are not asking for martyrs. We are asking for anchors. A tense silence stretched out, punctuated by the guttural cries of the returning tide. Then Lyra spoke, her voice low and strained. There are those among us who have already carried a burden heavier than any mortal should bear. Those whose grief has shaped them, warped them. Those who, perhaps, would be most receptive to the echoes. Meridian's face hardened. You're suggesting we offer this choice to the bereaved? To those who've lost everything? Not offered, Elara corrected, her expression grim. Entrusted. We believe that certain individuals possess the inherent resilience, the specific type of pain, to absorb and contain the anchor's influence. It is a delicate process, requiring a deep understanding of the void's nature, a willingness to surrender the self, and a faith that we can rebuild, stronger, from the ashes. She paused, the weight of her words settling heavily upon the group. In thinking of those who've faced the abyss of loss, who've stared into the void, and to tell the tale. Those who understand the quiet, profound despair that whispers beneath the surface of reality. A shudder passed through Grognak Tall. The widow's touch, he murmured, the term carrying a chilling resonance. The ones touched by the first blight. Their sorrow is already a shard of the void. The realization hit Meridian with the force of a physical blow. He knew, of course, the stories. Rumors whispered in Stormwind's darkest corners, tales of soldiers who returned from the frozen wastes, haunted by the ghosts of their fallen comrades, their eyes glazed with an unsettling, vacant sorrow. Of healers who dedicated their lives to easing suffering, only to be consumed by it themselves. And the children, orphaned by the endless wars, their innocent grief twisted into something ancient and terrible. Elara reached out, placing a hand on Meridian's arm, her touch surprisingly firm. We will guide them. We will nurture them. We will not force them. But we will offer them this choice, because to deny it is to condemn us all. As the ocean continued its relentless reclamation, Elara knew this wasn't a solution. It was a desperate, agonizing adaptation. A pact forged in the heart of despair, a testament to the terrifying beauty of surrender. And as she looked out at the rising tide, she couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't just saving Azeroth. They were becoming something else. Something profoundly, irrevocably changed. Chapter 9. The Salt of Sorrow. The salt spray clung to everything, to the shattered remains of the anchor, to the skin of the exhausted warriors, even to the very air, thick with the scent of ozone and drowned flesh. The immediate threat had passed, the monstrous drowned legion reduced to swirling eddies of seaweed and bone. But the silence that followed was heavier than the water that now lapped at their ankles. The visceral chaos of the assault had faded, leaving behind a residue of something far more unsettling, a profound, almost palpable grief. Stormwind's tactical brilliance, the Trolls' raw shamanic power, and the Elves' masterful manipulation of arcane energy had combined to achieve the impossible, but at a cost. The initial relief, the instinctive jubilation at the averted apocalypse, was rapidly dissolving, replaced by a shared, aching awareness of the depths they'd glimpsed. Meridian, still clutching his arm where Alara's hand had rested, found himself staring out at the shimmering surface of the returning sea, not with triumph, but with a chilling sense of recognition. "It's not just sorrow," he said, his voice raspy, barely audible above the receding waves. "It's Grognak." Ever pragmatic, grunted. "The void speaks through broken things. A fallen soldier remembers his death. A grieving parent remembers his child. It's natural. We are warriors, survivors. We feel the weight of loss." But Alara wasn't convinced. She moved with a deliberate grace, her elven eyes scanning the faces of the assembled group. A grim-faced Stormwind captain, a scarred Darkspear shaman, and a sentinel healer whose face was etched with the haunted expression of 1,000 deaths. It's more than natural. The void doesn't merely reflect sorrow on it. The anchor wasn't just a repository of darkness. It was a sponge for the grief of countless ages, concentrated and weaponized. Now, we've released it. She gestured to the rising tide, not with wonder, but with a mournful observation. The ocean returns, yes, but it doesn't simply cleanse. It remembers. It holds the echoes of every sorrow ever experienced, every trauma imprinted upon the world. We've become conduits for that pain, unknowingly amplifying its resonance. The widow's touch, as Grognak had called it, wasn't a curse, he realized with a growing dread, but a fundamental shift in their reality. The initial desperation, the need to simply, was already giving way to something colder, more complex. They were being subtly influenced by the remnants of that concentrated despair, their decisions clouded by an instinct they couldn't comprehend. Meridian, consumed by a burgeoning obsession, began to meticulously document the phenomenon. He was collecting samples of the salt-encrusted wreckage, analyzing the residual arcane energy clinging to it, seeking a tangible understanding of what they had unleashed. He saw patterns in the shifting tides, in the behavior of the newly emerged lifeforms, the mutated crustaceans, the luminous, skeletal fish, all seemingly drawn to areas of intense emotional residue. "It's organized," he muttered, a note of frantic urgency in his voice. "The void isn't chaotic. It's drawn to the darkest corners of the soul, amplifying the negative emotions until they become a force in themselves." Alara, watching him, offered a grim prediction. "We are attempting to build a dam against an endless flood. We can reinforce the walls, perhaps, but the water will always find a way, and the longer we fight it, the more it will erode us." The ceasefire, born of necessity, was morphing into a strange, uneasy truce. The alliance, forged in the crucible of shared peril, was fracturing under the weight of the pervasive sorrow. The Stormwind officers, accustomed to structured command and the familiar rituals of duty, struggled to adapt to the unsettling influence, exhibiting bursts of irrational anger and a profound inability to make decisive choices. The Trolls, already burdened by a history of trauma and loss, seemed to succumb to a quiet, debilitating despair, their shamanic energies shifting towards a mournful, almost hypnotic resonance. And the Elves, steeped in ancient wisdom and attuned to the subtle currents of magic, found themselves wrestling with a terrifying revelation that even the purest forms of light could be corrupted by the darkest of shadows. As night descended, painting the newly reclaimed seabed in shades of gray and violet, Alara walked towards the highest point of the wreckage, a partially submerged ship's hull. She looked out at the churning sea, a single, melancholic figure against the vastness of the returning tide. "We must learn to embrace the sorrow," she whispered, her voice carried away by the wind. "Not to fight it, but to understand it, to acknowledge its power, and to guide its flow. Because, ultimately, the void doesn't seek to destroy us. It seeks to us." The thought hung in the air, a chilling, profoundly unsettling truth. The survival of Azeroth wasn't merely about preventing a catastrophic drowning. It was about confronting the darkest depths of existence, and accepting that even in the face of oblivion, there might be a strange, terrible beauty to be found within the salt of sorrow. Chapter 10. The Salt of Sorrow. The returning tide didn't offer a triumphant return, not yet. It was a hesitant embrace, a grudging acceptance of a world irrevocably altered. The air hung thick with the scent of brine and something older, something faintly metallic, and profoundly unsettling, the residue of the void. The skeletal remains of ships, now half buried in the rapidly expanding seabed, were not monuments to lost glory, but grim reminders of the chaos they'd borne witness to. The initial alliance, forged in the crucible of near extinction, was already fraying around the edges. The Stormwind representatives, led by the grizzled Captain Lyra Darkstone, remained cautiously pragmatic, obsessed with quantifying the damage, assessing the resources, and demanding reparations. Their rigid adherence to order and established protocol, so jarring in the face of the apocalyptic landscape, felt almost aggressive. They saw the chaos not as a consequence of Na's machinations, but as a brutal, albeit regrettable, consequence of leadership failure. The Darkspear, under the stoic command of Groomsh Bloodfist, were a different proposition. The trauma of witnessing their ancestral land swallowed by the void had stripped away much of their inherent aggression. Bloodfist, normally a figure of explosive fury, moved with a quiet, almost mournful deliberation. The shamanic resonance Elara had observed in her people was now palpable, a deep, humming sorrow that settled over them like a shroud. They weren't driven by vengeance, but by a pervasive sense of loss, a feeling that something vital, something deeply rooted in their culture, had been irrevocably stolen. The Elves, represented by the enigmatic Archon Thalanar, were the most profoundly affected. Elara's words, spoken amidst the rising tide, had sunk into their collective consciousness like a poisoned bloom. The sight of the anchor shattering, the raw power of Elun unleashed, hadn't brought relief, but a chilling understanding. They continued to conduct intricate analyses of the void, not seeking to destroy it, but to it. They believed, with a terrifying clarity, that Nav hadn't simply sought to drown Azeroth. He had sought to expose its vulnerabilities, to reveal the inherent emptiness at the heart of existence. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the recovering seabed, a small group, including Lyra, Bloodfist, and Thalanar, gathered around Elara. She stood atop the ruined ship's hull, silhouetted against the bruised purple of the twilight, a solitary figure of unsettling calm. "The prism," Thalanar said, his voice a low, resonant murmur. "It revealed more than just the structure of the anchor. It showed us echoes, fragments of futures, branching and decaying, all culminating in this point, the shattering. It wasn't merely an artifact, it was a nexus." "A nexus of what?" Lyra demanded, her hand resting on the hilt of her cutlass, her eyes scanning the churning water. "Of potential," Thalanar replied, his gaze fixed on the darkening waves. "Of choices, of regrets, of the countless iterations of reality that could have been." N'Zoth didn't seek destruction. He sought resonance. He amplified the inherent instability within the universe, feeding on the yearning for oblivion. Bloodfist shifted uneasily, his massive frame radiating a palpable unease. "The sorrow, it isn't gone. It's deeper now, like a current pulling us under." Elara didn't respond immediately. She continued to stare out at the sea, her expression unreadable. The anchor wasn't simply a vessel for the void. She finally said, her voice laced with a profound sadness. It was a mirror reflecting back our own deepest fears, our most profound insecurities. No, that didn't us in the sense of inflicting suffering, but in demonstrating the chilling truth that we are, fundamentally, incomplete. That every act of creation, every expression of hope, is ultimately shadowed by the potential for annihilation. She turned to face the assembled group, her eyes gleaming with an unsettling intelligence. The salt isn't just from the sea. It's from the wounds we've inflicted upon ourselves, upon our world. It's the crystallized tears of lost civilizations, the residue of forgotten dreams. A silence descended upon them, broken only by the relentless roar of the returning ocean. Lyra, despite her pragmatism, felt a chill crawl down her spine. She realized, with a growing sense of dread, that Alara wasn't simply offering an explanation, she was presenting a diagnosis. "You're saying we were fighting a reflection?" she asked, the words feeling hollow and inadequate. Alara nodded slowly. "A reflection that will continue to shift, to distort, to demand our attention. The void doesn't seek to destroy us, no Bodhi. It seeks to remind us of our mortality, and to show us that even in the darkest currents, there is a strange, terrible beauty to be found in the acceptance of that truth." As she spoke, a shimmer appeared on the water's surface, a fleeting distortion of light and shadow. For a moment, a vision flashed before their eyes, a vision of Azeroth, consumed by darkness, but also a vision of a strange, serene beauty emerging from the chaos, a beauty born of acceptance, of quiet sorrow, and the unsettling realization that perhaps oblivion wasn't an ending, but simply a transition. The tide continued to rise, a cold, relentless embrace, carrying with it the salt of sorrow and the chilling knowledge that their battle had just begun. Chapter 11. Echoes in the current. The salt spray stung Lyra's eyes, a constant, irritating reminder of the chaos they'd barely escaped. The initial exhilaration of the returning ocean, the triumphant roar of the waves reclaiming their lost territory, had faded, replaced by a profound, unsettling quiet. The immediate threat, Azeroth's drowned legion, was dispersed, shattered by the combined force of their desperate alliance. But the weight of Alara's words, and the lingering image of that terrifyingly beautiful oblivion, pressed down on them with equal force. "It's not about stopping the void," Torvin Stonebeard, the grizzled Stormwind strategist, rumbled, his hand instinctively resting on the haft of his hammer. "It's about understanding what it—" He was a pragmatist, a soldier through and through, and the philosophical implications of Alara's diagnosis were clearly unsettling. This anchor, it's a focus, a lens. It doesn't just unleash the void, it channels it. And the void is hungry for stories. Around him, the remnants of the Alliance shifted uneasily. The trolls, led by the stoic shaman Vorlag, muttered amongst themselves, their faces etched with a wary respect for the ancient, unsettling power they'd confronted. The elves, under the watchful gaze of the enigmatic Sentinel Rees, remained largely silent, their inherent connection to the arcane radiating a palpable tension. Lyra, however, found herself increasingly drawn to Alara's cryptic pronouncements. The initial shock of the anchor's destruction had given way to a deep, unsettling curiosity. "So, we're fighting a reflection?" she repeated, the question now laced with a nascent understanding. "A distortion of our fears, our ambitions, our collective history? It's profoundly unsettling." Alara, perched on a salvaged section of a colossal, barnacle-encrusted galleon, observed them with eyes that seemed to hold the vastness of the ocean itself. "Consider the grave of ships," she said, her voice soft but carrying with a hypnotic resonance. "A graveyard born of conflict, of ambition, of the relentless pursuit of power. The void didn't create the ships, it merely magnified the tragedy, amplified the sorrow. It's a conduit, drawing upon the emotional weight of the past. She gestured towards the swirling currents, now a vibrant turquoise as the ocean reclaimed the seabed. The salt water isn't just salt. It's distilled regret, concentrated loss. The more we fight against it, against the reflection, the stronger it becomes. The more we acknowledge the beauty and the horror within that reflection, the less it controls us. Suddenly, a tremor ran through the ground, a subtle vibration that spread through the recovered shipwrecks. Race, ever vigilant, immediately raised a hand, signaling a halt to all activity. "Something's shifting," he murmured, his senses attuned to the delicate balance of the restored landscape. As they watched, a section of the seabed near the shattered anchor began to glow with a sickly, iridescent light. The light intensified, coalescing into a shimmering, translucent figure, a miniature version of the anchor itself, pulsing with the same void energy that had ravaged their world. It wasn't malevolent, not overtly, but it was undeniably, its ethereal form rotating slowly, as if scanning them. "It's responding," Vorlag said, his voice tight with apprehension. "It's acknowledging our presence. It's feeding on our uncertainty." As they observed, a new vision flickered through the swirling water, sharper and more vivid than the previous one. This time, it wasn't a single image, but a cascade of fractured memories, snippets of lives lost, battles fought, civilizations risen and fallen. They saw the ancient war between the Titans and the old gods, the rise and fall of the dragonflights, the countless tragedies that had shaped Azeroth's history. The beauty Alara spoke of emerged a poignant acceptance of the cyclical nature of existence, the inevitability of decay and rebirth. But interwoven within this beauty was the agonizing truth: every conflict, every act of violence, every moment of despair, fueled the void, strengthened the reflection. "It's not a weapon," Lyra realized, a cold dread settling over her. "It's a mirror. And we, with our anger, our grief, our ambitions, we are the ones feeding the mirror." Alara nodded, her expression unreadable. "The tide is not merely rising, Lyra. It's remembering." She reached out, her hand hovering just above the shimmering miniature anchor. "And perhaps if we are brave enough to to accept the truth of our reflection, it will finally cease to demand our attention." But as her hand moved closer, a low, guttural growl echoed across the newly formed shoreline. The miniature anchor pulsed with an even brighter light, and the shimmering figure expanded, solidifying into a grotesque parody of a humanoid form, a drowned Legion soldier, its flesh perpetually slick with seawater, its eyes glowing with an unsettling intelligence. It wasn't simply defending the anchor, it was testing them. It was reminding them of the darkness within themselves, and the eternal horrifying beauty of the abyss. The tide, it seemed, was not just returning, but was beginning to surge again. Chapter 12. Echoes of the Deep. The roar of the returning sea still vibrated through the bones of the high ground, a primal symphony of unleashed water and unleashed power. The immediate threat of the drowned Legion had been largely contained, but the unsettling truth lingered: they weren't merely mindless puppets, they were reflections, amplified by the fear and uncertainty radiating from the three leaders. The miniature anchor, now stabilized, still pulsed with a sickly, opalescent light, a constant, agonizing reminder of the abyss they'd narrowly averted. Stormwind's Captain Alaric Stonehelm, his face streaked with seawater and grime, adjusted the focus of the salvaged cannons. The last of the Orcish shamans, Grokter, slumped against a crumbling mast, exhausted but humming with residual arcane energy. The elven sentinel, Lyra Sunstrider, meticulously examined the fractured remnants of the prism ruin, searching for any sign of further void resonance. Despite the palpable relief, a heavy weight pressed on them all: the realization that the battle hadn't truly ended. "The tremors are increasing," Grokter rumbled. his voice a guttural rasp. The earth remembers the disruption. N'Zoth's influence still clings to this place, like seaweed on a drowned corpse. Lyra nodded grimly. The prism is functioning, but the Void signature, it's evolving. It's not just reflecting our anger, it's incorporating it. It's learning. The memory of the drowned Legion soldier, the grotesque parody that had materialized as a test, burned in their minds. It was a chilling revelation. N'Zoth wasn't simply a destroyer, he was a student. A perverse artist sculpting his power from the despair of the world. Suddenly, a ripple disturbed the surface of the newly formed tide. Not a violent wave, but a slow, deliberate movement, as if something vast and unseen was stirring beneath the waves. The miniature anchor flared brilliantly, the light shifting from a sickly opalescent to a bruised, churning violet. "It's responding," Alaric shouted, barking orders to the remaining cannon crews. "Prepare for immediate engagement." But before the cannons could unleash another volley, a new manifestation emerged. Not another drowned Legion soldier, but something far more insidious. From the swirling water, a vast, shimmering hand materialized, skeletal and draped in seaweed, its fingers tipped with bioluminescent coral. It wasn't wielding a weapon, it simply plied. The hand extended directly towards Alara, who stood motionless, her gaze locked on the miniature anchor. A soft, sibilant voice, not spoken but directly within their minds, echoed through the air. "You seek to understand," the voice whispered, laced with an ancient, suffocating sorrow. "But understanding requires acceptance. Acceptance requires surrender." Alara didn't flinch. Instead, she took a step forward, her hand outstretched, palm facing the spectral hand. "We don't seek surrender, N'Zoth," she said, her voice imbued with a surprising strength. "We seek balance. We seek to break the cycle." The spectral hand tightened its grip, the bioluminescent coral pulsing with an unnerving rhythm. The air around Alara shimmered, and the miniature anchor flared again, now casting grotesque, dancing shadows across the ravaged seabed. Suddenly, the ground beneath them groaned. Cracks spiderwebbed across the stone, and a plume of black, void-infused mist erupted from the earth. Then, the reflections began. Not in the water, not in the shattered ruins, but in Torre. Alaric, consumed by the urge to control, found his hand instinctively reaching for his sword, a primal instinct for domination surging through him. Groktor, haunted by the slaughter of his people, began to chant a dark, ancient prayer, his eyes glazing over with a terrifying fervor. And Lyra saw herself, not as a sentinel, a protector of light, but as a grieving child, endlessly reliving the loss of her family, the sorrow fueling her every action, twisting her efforts to protect into a desperate, futile plea for redemption. The miniature anchor pulsed with terrifying intensity, drawing on these individual reflections, solidifying them into monstrous manifestations, a corrupted Stormwind knight wielding a blade of solidified sorrow, a shamanic wraith consumed by rage, and a spectral elven warrior forever trapped in the agony of loss. "It's feeding on our pain," Lyra screamed, realizing the terrible truth. "We're not fighting a god, we're fighting ourselves." Alara, struggling to maintain control, raised her hands, channeling the last vestiges of Elun's light. "We must resist. We must confront the darkness within, not allow it to define us." The battle had shifted. It was no longer a desperate alliance against an external threat, but a brutal internal war, a struggle for the very souls of the three leaders, and perhaps the future of Azeroth. The tide was rising again, and this time it wasn't just water. It was the weight of countless sorrows, the echo of every conflict, every despair, every moment of defeat, threatening to drown them all. Chapter 13. The weight of reflections. The roar of the returning tide was a physical assault, a churning, icy breath that ripped across the newly formed battlefield. Salt spray stung Lyra's eyes, blurring the scene, the shattered remains of the anchor, the bleached bones of the drowned legion still twitching with residual void energy, and the three figures, exhausted and coated in grime, standing together on the rising dunes. The immediate threat was gone, but a deeper unease settled upon them, a chilling realization that the true battle hadn't been fought against Azeroth, but against the darkness that resided within themselves. Groktor, still chanting fragments of the corrupted prayer, had fallen silent. The fervor in his eyes had dulled, replaced by a vacant horror. He was no longer a raging orc, consumed by vengeance, but a shell, a vessel for the raw, untamed grief that had once driven him. He stared blankly at the receding waters, a faint, shimmering outline of a young boy visible in his vacant gaze, a boy robbed of his home, his family, his future. "Is empty," Elara whispered, her hand instinctively reaching for the hilt of her Elune-infused blade. The light, emanating from it, pulsed with a weary resilience, struggling to push back the lingering shadow. The anchor didn't just create monsters, it extracted the core of who we are, stripped away the things that made us Tarsiwa. Lyra, despite her earlier frantic recognition, still felt the insidious pull of the reflection shed glimpsed the grieving child. The weight of her family's loss, a burden shed carried since the initial cataclysm, felt amplified tenfold, a suffocating blanket threatening to smother her resolve. She gripped her staff, the familiar magic of fragile comfort against the overwhelming sadness. "We thought it was about survival," she said, her voice hoarse. "We focused on the external threat, on preventing the end of the world. But the end of the world within us. Nelzewe exploited our vulnerabilities, using our pain as a key." A tense silence followed, broken only by the insistent lap of the waves. The landscape itself seemed to hold its breath, as if awaiting the next manifestation, the next wave of anguish to coalesce. Suddenly, a tremor ran through the ground, and from the swirling sea, a figure solidified, a Stormwind knight, clad in blackened, corroded plate armor, his face a mask of perpetual sorrow, his blade a wickedly curved scimitar, pulsed with an icy blue light, the solidified essence of Lyra's grief. "This is not a reflection of Stormwind," she said, her voice a hollow echo. "This is a reflection of a kingdom consumed by the inability to grieve, to accept its own failures." The knight lunged, a whirlwind of sorrow and steel. Recognizing the pattern, Elara unleashed a renewed burst of Elune's light, forcing the knight back with a searing blast. "We can't fight our reflections. We have to them." From the heart of the drowned legion, a spectral shaman emerged, a wraith woven from rage and the desperate echoes of Groktor's lost clan. This manifestation, fueled by the orcs' internal turmoil, roared with primal fury, a living embodiment of vengeance. "Silence!" he shrieked, raising skeletal hands crackling with lightning. "This weakness, this hesitation, it is the rot of the Horde." The battle shifted again, no longer a coordinated assault, but a desperate, chaotic dance of resistance. Lyra attempted to channel a purifying beam, but the image of her lost family, her parents, her friends threatened to overwhelm her, blurring the focus, creating a swirling vortex of sorrow that mirrored the battlefield. "Don't fight the memories," Elara shouted, desperately attempting to guide Lyra's focus. "Channel the you gain from overcoming them. Let the love, not the loss, fuel your magic." The weight of it all pressed down on her, the knowledge that their salvation wasn't just about defeating these reflections, but about mastering them, accepting the scars of the past, and forging a new future from the wreckage. The sea continued to rise, and with it, the chilling realization Azeroth wasn't just drowning in darkness, it was drowning in darkness. As Groktor, still lost in the echoes of his past, attempted to advance on the night, Lyra, drawing on a newfound resolve, focused her energy, not on erasing the grief, but on transforming it. She visualized her parents' faces, not in a moment of loss, but in a moment of pride, of love. She saw her friends smiling, celebrating a victory, not mourning a defeat. She began to weave a counter-reflection, a shield of hope built from the fragments of her memories, and directed the beam towards the raging wraith. The effect was immediate. The spectral shaman screamed in agony as his rage subsided, his form dissolving into motes of shimmering light. "It's fading," Elara gasped, her face alight with a flicker of triumph. "We're not destined to be consumed. We can control the reflection, guide it." The tide continued to rise, but now, instead of an oppressive force, it felt like a cleansing. The three leaders, battered and bruised, stood together, not as warring factions, but as reluctant allies, bound by the shared understanding that the greatest battle they would ever fight was not against an ancient god, but against the shadows within their own hearts. Chapter 14. Echoes of the Tide. The salt spray stung Lyra's face as the ocean, once a cruel predator, now surged with a hesitant, almost apologetic rhythm. The devastation was breathtaking. Ship hulls jutted from the newly reclaimed seabed, draped in seaweed and slick with retreating brine. But more profoundly, the air felt lighter. The oppressive weight of Nozoth's influence noticeably diminished. The shimmering, distorted echoes that had plagued the battlefield were fading, replaced by the sharp scent of brine and the distant cries of gulls. "It's..." Valara gasped, her face alight with a flicker of triumph. "We're not destined to be consumed. We can control the reflection, guide it." The pronouncement hung in the air, a fragile seed of hope planted in the ravaged landscape. Around her, the weary figures of Grokter and King Varric shifted, their faces etched with a mixture of exhaustion and profound contemplation. The initial triumph, the shattering of the anchor, had revealed not just the immense power of No's influence, but the terrifying potential within themselves. Lyra, still tingling with the exertion of channeling Elun's power, adjusted the intricate focusing lenses salvaged from the prism ruin. The process, it wasn't about destroying the reflection, she said, her voice raw but firm. It was about shifting the focus, about acknowledging the pain, the rage, and actively choosing a different narrative. Groktor, unusually silent for much of the battle, shifted his weight, the scarred metal of his armor creaking. The drowned one he feeds on despair, on the certainty of destruction. By confronting it, by weaving a new light, we starved him. He glanced at the dissolving remains of the drowned legion, swirling motes of water and bone. "It's a strange victory, isn't it? To win by understanding the monsters in our own minds." The alliance, born of desperate necessity, began to take shape. Stormwind's cannon crews, their faces grim with the memory of carnage, began to dismantle the wreckage, prioritizing the construction of makeshift shelters from the salvaged lumber. The Darkspear Trolls, their shamanic energy still faintly crackling around them, began to analyze the residual void energy, searching for ways to mitigate its lingering effects. The Sentinels, under Elara's guidance, established a rudimentary observation post within the partially collapsed ruins of Darnassus, meticulously documenting the changes in the surrounding waters, the subtle shifts in currents, the returning marine life. "We must understand the void was so potent here," Elara stated, her hands tracing the intricate carvings on a salvaged column. This wasn't merely a conduit for Nozoth's power. The anchor it amplified, existing trauma. It latched onto the collective grief, the centuries of conflict, and turned it into a weapon. King Varric approached Lyra, his face etched with a thoughtful frown. The Salt War, it wasn't a battle for resources. It was a battle for souls. Nozoth didn't just want the anchor. He wanted to unravel us, to break our spirits, and use that brokenness as a stepping stone to further corruption. A heavy silence descended as the realization settled upon them. The returning sea wasn't just washing away the damage, it was carrying away the accumulated bitterness, the ingrained hatred. But, as Alara observed, the tide continued to rise, and with it, the chilling realization Azeroth wasn't just drowning in darkness, it was drowning in torment. The echoes of the past, the wounds of generations, threatened to resurface, to corrupt the fragile alliance they had forged. Lyra stepped forward, addressing her companions. We cannot ignore the pain. We must not try to bury it. Instead, we must acknowledge it, understand it, and use it as a catalyst for change. We must become the guardians of not just Azeroth, but also of our own hearts. She directed her attention back to the newly formed channel of water flowing around them. The tide is rising, yes, but it's not a tide of destruction. It's a tide of rebirth. Let us use this moment, this shared understanding, to begin rebuilding, not just our kingdoms, but our world and ourselves. Suddenly, a tremor ran through the seabed. The ground beneath their feet shifted again, and a small, submerged structure began to rise from the depths. A perfectly preserved dwarven shrine, dedicated to the ancient sea god Thalicia. Within its crumbling chambers, bathed in the ethereal glow of Elun's returning light, a single, polished stone lay on an altar, pulsing with a faint turquoise energy. Groktor approached, instinctively understanding the significance. The heart of Thalicia, he muttered, picking up the stone. A fragment of balance, a reminder that even the deepest darkness can be countered by a sincere heart and a willingness to heal. As he held the stone aloft, a surge of blue energy pulsed outwards, washing over the recovering coastline, visibly strengthening the returning tide and accelerating the growth of the fledgling marine life. The final echoes of Nazoth's influence, faint but undeniable, hissed and dissipated like smoke. The three leaders, standing united amidst the reborn landscape, knew their work had only just begun. The fight against Nazoth was over, but the fight for Azeroth and for their souls was truly underway. Chapter 15. The echo of Thalicia, the air, thick with the scent of salt water and something akin to ozone, still vibrated with the residual energy of the anchor's destruction. The immediate chaos of the confrontation was receding, replaced by a quiet, almost reverent observation of the returning tide. The newly formed channel, a vibrant blue serpent carving a path through the bleached seabed, pulsed with an unnatural rhythm, a physical manifestation of the world's tentative recovery. The tide is rising, yes, but it's not a tide of destruction. Stormwind's Lady Lyra Sunstrider said, her voice carrying across the damp, newly exposed expanse. It's a tide of rebirth. Let us use this moment, this shared understanding, to begin rebuilding, not just our kingdoms, but our world and ourselves. Her words, imbued with a solemn determination, resonated with the exhausted but hopeful faces of Groktor and the stoic high priestess Ileana. Suddenly a tremor ran through the seabed, sharper this time, and the ground beneath their feet shifted again, accompanied by a deep groan of displaced stone. From the churning, turquoise water, a small submerged structure began to rise with disconcerting speed, a perfectly preserved dwarven shrine, dedicated to the ancient sea god Thalicia. It was breathtaking, a miniature cathedral of intricately carved gray stone, remarkably intact despite centuries of submersion and the void's corrosive influence. Remarkable, muttered Torvin Stonebeard, one of the few dwarven representatives present, his grizzled face etched with disbelief. To think it could still be here, within its crumbling chambers, bathed in the ethereal glow of Elun's returning light. A single polished stone lay on an altar, pulsing with a faint turquoise energy. It was roughly the size of a clenched fist, smooth and cool to the touch, radiating a subtle warmth. Groktor, the Orcish shaman, approached with an instinctive understanding, his 6 eyes scanning the shrine with focused intensity. The heart of Thalicia, he muttered, picking up the stone. A fragment of balance, a reminder that even the deepest darkness can be countered by a sincere heart and a willingness to heal. As he held the stone aloft, a surge of blue energy pulsed outwards, washing over the recovering coastline, visibly strengthening the returning tide and accelerating the growth of the fledgling marine life. Tiny, bioluminescent fish darted through the newly formed currents, and patches of vibrant green algae began to bloom on the exposed seabed. The final echoes of N'Zoth's influence, faint but undeniable, hissed and dissipated like smoke, leaving behind a palpable sense of lightness. Ileana, the elven high priestess, stepped forward, her eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. "Elune blesses this place," she intoned, her voice soft but filled with reverence. "The goddess sees our unity, our willingness to sacrifice for the good of Azeroth. This stone, it is a conduit for her power, a beacon against the encroaching void." The three leaders, standing united amidst the reborn landscape, knew their work had only just begun. The fight against N'Zoth was over, but the fight for Azeroth, and for their souls, was truly underway. "We've witnessed a miracle," Lyra observed, turning her gaze towards the shrine. "But miracles require stewardship. We cannot simply observe the tide return. We must ensure its strength, protect its purity. The dwarves, with your understanding of the earth, your skill in crafting and preserving, you are vital to this endeavor." Torvin, ever pragmatic, nodded. "The shrine itself will require stabilization. We can reinforce the structure, create a sanctuary to harness Thalicia's power, perhaps even delve deeper into her lore, the secrets of the deep, the balance of the oceans." As they began to examine the shrine further, Ileana noticed something unsettling. The energy emanating from the stone, it's not merely restorative. There's a resonance, a lingering shadow. It speaks of a loss, a profound sadness connected to this place. She examined the altar more closely, her fingers tracing the intricate carvings depicting Thalicia, a serene figure with flowing robes, holding a trident entwined with coral. This shrine was not just a place of worship. It was a prison, she declared, her voice laced with concern. Thalicia willingly bound herself here, alongside a significant portion of her power, to contain a far greater threat, a nascent void spawn, corrupted by N'Zoth's influence. This stone, it isn't just a fragment of balance, it's a piece of the prison itself. A chilling realization dawned upon them. N'Zoth hadn't simply sought to expose Kul Tiras, he had been actively attempting to exploit a weakened point in the Veil, to re-establish a foothold in Azeroth, starting with the legacy of a forgotten goddess. Groktor gripped the heart of Thalicia tighter, his brow furrowed. "We stopped the anchor, but we have awakened a slumbering danger. We must understand the full extent of this prison, and what remains within before it can be unleashed again." The tide, once a symbol of rebirth, now seemed to carry a new weight, a silent reminder of the long, arduous task ahead. The coming days would be dedicated not just to rebuilding, but to unraveling the mysteries of Thalicia, and preparing for a battle that, they suspected, was far from over.